Okay, we are going to hold questions towards to the end on the panel. So I'll introduce our second speaker of the session, which is Michaela Mayrhofer. Michaela is, she earned her PhD from a combination of French and Austrian universities in political science, is that correct? And has been involved in a whole host of different projects associated with the politics and governance of life science data, specifically the BBMRI, which is the biobanking and medical research infrastructure, I think. Is that all right? Is that all correct? She's going to explain that, she says. And so I think I'll just hand over to her, and she'll do a better job than I've done.
Thank you for the kind introduction and having me here. I always like to present myself as the usual suspect of BBMRI, so you see that I have a friendly face and don't be scared to connect to us. BBMRI stands for the Biobanking and Biomolecular Resources Research Infrastructure, European Research Infrastructure Consortium. And we have an inside joke, or actually two. You see that everything started with a European project because only through that such an acronym can come about. And B, if you can say it to anyone without stumbling, you can become a member in our organization. Today, I'm talking about an initiative that BBMRI is leading and is collaborating with a few other organizations, and it is the GDPR Code of Conduct for Health Research Initiative. And of course, when you talk about anything that has to be, that is related to the GDPR, you should also take into account what the original objective of the GDPR is, or maybe was. It aimed at harmonizing the data protection rules in the European Union. I think it failed to manage that, at least at the start, because although it was meant as a regulation, in practice very often it is more a directive, because especially for our field, a lot of country derogations, a lot of implementation is happening today. The other objective is to balance the enforcement of protection of rights of the individuals, and at the same time to facilitate the free flow of personal data in a single market. Now, Jan Albrecht was in the European Parliament the rapporteur of the Parliament's take on the GDPR. And this is a cartoon that he shared on LinkedIn, and I think it shows clearly how he saw and a lot of MEPs, he saw the GDPR. So there is this poor man looking at his mobile phone, being the consumer and being threatened by a crocodile and shark corporation that just wants their data. Whereas research is not there, and I had the chance then to talk to Jan Albrecht very early on in the process, where he said, well, there will be a research exemption in the end, but this is our key focus. Now, what it is in the public sphere, so to say, is a jack of all trades. I here borrowed the image of the BMW advertisement, because it depicts an image that is in German, the eierlegende Wollmilchsau, that is really an animal that can do it all. It produces cheese, eggs, meat, and has a happy face on top of that. And that was, at least at the outset, the goal of what the GDPR should achieve. The lawmaking process took, I recall, more than 5 years, and the outcome is really the general data protection regulation, and research is somewhere the exemption, and we are in the process of figuring out what it means for us in practice. Now, when we go down to the law, to the GDPR, there's the possibility to start a code of conduct, and this is what I want to focus for the next couple of minutes. Now, Generally, a code of conduct is a set of rules outlining the social norm, responsibilities, and practices for individuals, for organizations. In our field, we know it within our organization. I knew it from my universities. I heard some rumors how difficult it was to make code of conducts happening, and another topic is have people adhere to it. Among partners in a research consortium, these are the set of rules we agree on, but you know who your partners are, more or less. You have a defined set of what it is. Now, what the GDPR allows for is a sector-specific code, and it specifies it as such in its Article 40 and a little bit more in 41. In the first paragraph, it says that the member states, the supervisory authorities, and the board and the commission shall encourage the drawing up of codes of conduct intended to contribute to the proper application of this regulation, taking into account the specific features of the various processing sectors and specific needs of micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises, and associations or bodies representing categories of controllers of processes may prepare codes of conduct. When you look into further details, you find a lot of elements that for our sector, health sector, are fairly interesting. Fair and transparent processing, the legitimate interest pursued by controllers in specific contexts, the collection of personal data, pseudonymization, information, the information provided to and the protection of children in a manner which the consent of the holder and parental responsibility over children is to be obtained, and so on and so forth. So relatively early on, we thought that it could be a good idea in pursuing such a code. And from the BBMRI side, we figured out, well, it doesn't make sense at all to start this alone. A, it's a huge endeavor. B, it should make sense for all our sector. And we teamed up and presented the ideas in various settings with the aim to contribute to the proper application of the GDPR, that it is really adhering and makes sense to what we are doing in our area of health research, to clarify and specify certain rules, which is happening to some extent by the lawmakers in the member states still. However, what it means in practice is yet another translational exercise that we have to go on to help demonstrate compliance and to help foster the transparency and trust. And to trust, I will come back with my closing argument as well. Now, briefly, what happened so far, key activities, a couple of meetings, and level of involvement. When we thought in how we can do this together with other organizations, we said we set up a forum of individuals and organizations that would be interested in such an initiative, in saying, well, if we are exploring in that direction, which way should we go? What are the key aspects we should focus on, and then enlarge from there? We found out relatively early that we have to structure the forum as well in what we call reference groups. One of them would be genetics, the other one would focus more on consent of minors, the other would be patient organization, and to have a very small drafting group that comes up with a what we initially thought good draft as soon as possible that can be tiered about, commented from the community, and bring it all together. The drafting group is working. The draft hopefully will be able to be communicated in sections by the end of the year. And we open it with further comments for public consultation, even to a broader group, very likely in spring 2019. Now, when you look at the level of involvement, you see that the partners that we are engaging with come from industry, as well as the health sector, as well as from patient organizations and health research at large, and other BMS research infrastructures that would include our colleagues here from Elixir. I'll spare you the details of the meeting lists we have and go into the state of the work where we are. The key topics are naturally lawfulness of processing, responsibility of controller processor and their relationship, appropriate safeguards, anonymization versus personal data, and to give as many practical examples in reference to existing guidelines. So the key is not to reinvent the wheel anew. Now, this text, the state of work, looks fairly easy. In the end, it is not, because basically harmonization is a myth. It is something that we have to work on every day. And I would say that we have to work towards compatibility between the different legislations that exist across Europe. And we have to take into account that research is an exception, and various member states take different takes on what is important for them to put out in the research exemption. And bringing this together in a sensible draft that then can be commented is the task of the drafting group. Now, the structure of the code, we have moved forward in collaboration also, or in exchange with the European Commission, to say, well, if we do it like that, would this be acceptable? And I come back to that, to the details with the Commission also later. Now, the structure of the code should be easily understandable in a non-legalistic language, should build on question and answer format, and should follow the structure that you're seeing here in a process workflow that makes sense to the especially data processor and controller. The process of amplifying safeguards in terms of data minimization, pseudonymization, anonymization, whenever we can, we will graphically deploy. An example from the text, as mentioned, is we have a question, we have an explanation, we have an example, and we will set out for a rule. And for me, it is always the key to say what the code of conduct, if it enters into force, is definitely not. It is not the Holy Grail, but it is something to aspire for because it can create clarity, and if it goes through the procedure as outlined in Article 4041, is getting soft law within the European Union. Why is that? The governance specification say that when you outline a code, you do not only have to issue the content of it, you also have to set up a governance structure, a monitoring body. And once the code is ready in its draft version, you turn it in at the national DPO that depicts, in this case, this is of European value. It has to be then assessed by the European Data Protection Board. And this assessment will very likely take about 6 months. It will go back and forth after public consultation, and if approved, is something that even the national DPAs would refer to and say, well, here you have some clarity and some orientation in what you will specify. The difference to national code of conducts, there is, for instance, one in the making in Poland, is that the Polish one is very sector-specific to biobanks and, of course, only valid in Poland. With the timeline in an ideal world was to have a consolidating first draft early 2018, to share the drafts with you in the second quarter, to have public consultation and submission by the end of this year. Now, what about the reality check about this ideal timeline? Well, as of May, the status was that not all the countries in Europe have implemented the GDPR, and this slide holds almost up today. So there are still a couple of countries who have not yet implemented the GDPR, and this message I even find much more interesting because it is a statement from the president of the French Data Protection Authority saying 17 out of 24 national data protection authorities report that the resources and manpower do not suffice to meet their obligations. And this statement has nothing to do with research. This statement has something to do with the reality of the general data protection regulation, and a lot of researchers, well, I'm sure many of you will have the same experience. If you did not have a good relationship with your national data protection authority at the start, now it's very hard to start up a dialogue and even a relationship, either because they're understaffed or because they're now overwhelmed. And sometimes the relationship between data protection regulators or authorities and researchers had been tainted on a communication level. Now, again, what makes the sector-specific code of interest is it would be valid across Europe. However, to date, we do not know what the exact procedure is in how to turn in such a code. The European data protection body, who took over from the Working Party 29, has since a year the idea of a process on its mind. It has set up a working group to specify the details, to make even this process open for public consultation. And it was shifted from January this year until December, January next year already, even discussing the process, how to turn it in. So what will be realistic, the procedure will be discussed, say, December, then until it is really possible to turn in a code of conduct is very likely spring and summer 2019. So the realistic timeline would be the following, that the submission via the national DPA would be the earliest into December 2019. For me, that is good news because it also feeds back into the difficult process in drafting what should be already a harmonized process, but with the various member state derogations requires a lot of dialogue, also not only among us researchers, but among the broader group of stakeholders. If you're interested to join, see here the website. And I promised you to close with a remark on trust. And I personally would like to shift trust to trustworthiness because there's a beautiful statement by Bertolt Brecht: what destroys faith is invoking it. Was Vertrauen zerstört, ist, wenn man es einfordert. And when I graduated, I got this beautiful T-shirt, "Trust me, I'm a doctor," and then in small letters it says, "of philosophy." Whatever PhD you have, whatever your background is, if you really ask people to trust you, I think, raise alarms. So trustworthiness is something that you have to prove every day, and initiatives, as we have heard throughout the conference here, are one element of it, and I hope that the Code of Conduct can be yet another. With this, I would like to close my presentation, thank my collaborators from the drafting group, and thank you again for being able to speak here.